It's about Ghana-US relations. First, we were slapped with 10% tariff that was increased to 15%. And then we're included in 36 countries that were going to be placed on a visa ban. But in the meantime, all 5-year visas were cancelled and we were restricted to single entry 3 months. It shows the tightening situation in our foreign relations, but I do think that we still enjoy good relations with the United States of America. We were approached by the U.S. to accept third-party nationals who were being removed from the U.S. And we agreed with them that West African nationals, were acceptable because all our fellow West Africans don't need a visa to come to our country. So if they decided to travel from US to Accra, they don't need a visa anyway. So if you're bringing our colleague West Africans back, that's okay. And so I think that agreement has been activated, and a first batch of 14 nationals came. Several of them were our Nigerian brothers. They opted to go back home, and so we put them on buses, to be able to go back home. One of them was a Gambian who it's not as easy. You have to get him an air ticket to be able to facilitate his travel. So what we've done is contacted their embassy to let them know of his presence so that they can facilitate his return to Gambia. And so that's the issue with regards to deportations and arrivals. West Africa has the protocol of free movement. And so any West African is free to come to Ghana and be able to stay for 90 days. And so if they decide to bring them, we don't have a problem accepting them.
The U.S. President Donald Trump has taken a hard stance. He says foreigners, especially those who entered the country illegally or those convicted of violent crimes, have no place in America. But instead of sending them back to their own homelands, he has chosen a different path. These people are being deported to Africa under a policy the U.S. quietly calls third world deportations. In recent months, several African nations have begun to accept these deportees. And now, Ghana has stepped into the spotlight. It has become the first West African country to agree to this deal with Washington. But the decision sparks a troubling question. Did Ghana make the right move by opening its doors? Or has it unknowingly played into the hands of the United States? This is where the story begins. As we mentioned at the start, the Trump administration has been knocking on the doors of several African nations. The goal? To find countries willing to accept deportees as part of Washington's crackdown on immigration. And now, Ghana has stepped forward. It has become the very first West African country to agree. According to reports confirmed by President John Mahama himself, 14 deportees have already arrived in Ghana. Among them were Nigerians and a Gambian. More are expected soon. But Ghana is not their final destination. Arrangements are underway to send them back to their home countries. President Mahama later spoke openly about the deal. He explained that the U.S. had approached Ghana to act as a receiving hub. In his own words, "We were approached by the U.S. to accept third-party nationals who were being removed from the U.S., and we agreed that West African nationals were acceptable. All our fellow West African nationals don't need visas to come to our country." President Mahama pointed to ECOWAS rules as the foundation for his decision. The regional bloc allows citizens of West African states to move freely across borders, living in member countries for up to 90 days without a visa. In his words, West Africans don't need a visa anyway to come to Ghana. But beneath that explanation, the story becomes more complex. The Ghanaian leader admitted that relations with Washington had grown tense. U.S. tariffs on Ghanaian goods had been raised. Visa restrictions were hitting Ghanaian nationals. He described the situation as a tightening one, and yet he still called the overall relationship positive. That contradiction raises the real question. If relations are strained, why did Ghana agree to a deal that forces it to accept U.S. deportees? What could Ghana possibly be getting in return? The truth is, no one knows for sure. But what we do know is that the answer points to something far bigger. It shows why African nations must tread carefully when making deals with the West, especially the United States. Since Donald Trump came to power, his government has taken bold, erratic steps. Moves that have unsettled allies and isolated Washington from parts of the world. Among the most controversial, deporting foreign nationals convicted of violent crimes. A policy that has triggered global backlash. And behind it all lies a deeper concern: the vast power imbalance between the United States and developing nations. A gap that leaves Africa vulnerable to security risks, vulnerable to human rights abuses, and vulnerable to the slow erosion of international law. This policy didn't start with Africa. It began in March, with El Salvador. The U.S. quietly paid the Salvadoran government $5 million to take in more than 250 Venezuelan deportees. They were locked away in a maximum security prison already infamous for its brutal conditions and human rights abuses. The exact details of the deal remain a mystery, but the rewards were clear. President Nayib Bukele received a coveted visit to the White House and public praise from Washington, even as critics accused him of crushing civil liberties at home. From there, the strategy expanded. The Trump administration turned its eyes to Africa. Deportations didn't just involve Africans. Venezuelans, Jamaicans, Yemenis, even Vietnamese nationals were suddenly being sent to countries like South Sudan and Eswatini. The Department of Homeland Security offered a simple explanation. These individuals couldn't be sent home because their own countries refused to take them back, so instead, they were rerouted. The engine behind these deportations was a ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court in June. The decision gave Washington the green light to send migrants to third countries, without warning and without any legal recourse. In one sweep, the court brushed aside international protections. Even the Convention Against Torture, a treaty the U.S. itself had signed, was effectively ignored. Safeguards designed to prevent deportations to countries where torture was likely, wiped away. The conservative majority offered no explanation, only silence. And in that silence, the U.S. gained broad new powers to move people across the world. Almost immediately, the deals began. In April, the U.S. reportedly paid Rwanda $100,000 to accept an Iraqi refugee accused of ties to ISIS. This happened despite Washington's own 2023 State Department report warning of Rwanda's harsh and life-threatening prison conditions. A similar story played out in Eswatini. According to the New York Times, an American diplomat urged the kingdom to take in deportees. Yet another State Department report had already documented the grim reality on the ground: extrajudicial killings, torture, and rampant human rights abuses. And still, the policy pushed forward. But the problem doesn't stop with prisons or human rights. These deportations are shrouded in secrecy. Citizens in host countries are rarely told what their governments agreed to. Trust begins to erode. And that secrecy is now clouding Ghana's own deal with Washington. What, if anything, is Ghana actually getting in return? This is why many believe the United States isn't negotiating with Africa, it's pressuring it. Across the continent, citizens suspect that aid and trade have been turned into weapons. In South Sudan and Eswatini, people fear their governments were forced into compliance. In exchange, Washington won quiet favors from leaders eager to stay on the Trump administration's good side. In May, reports surfaced that the U.S. had approached Angola, Benin, Equatorial Guinea, and even Libya, asking them to take in deportees. Then in June, the New York Times revealed the true scale of the operation. 58 countries, many of them in Africa, had come under U.S. pressure to accept. The word pressure is no exaggeration. Nearly all the nations targeted by Washington were already under U.S. sanctions, travel bans, visa restrictions, or tariffs. And that's where the danger lies. Leaders desperate to ease the strain may comply with deals that serve America's interests, but not their own. Trump's tariffs have become more than just economic weapons. They are bargaining chips, tools to force African nations into signing on to a deportation scheme they may not truly want. In July, President Trump convened a mini-summit inside the White House. Around the table sat the leaders of Senegal, Mauritania, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia, and Gabon. Officially, the talks were about critical minerals: gold, bauxite, oil. But behind closed doors, whispers suggested another motive: deals on deportations. The strongest confirmation came from Nigeria. Its own foreign minister admitted publicly that Washington had been pressuring African nations to accept deportees, but Nigeria took a different path. It rejected the deal outright. Nigeria made it clear it would not bow to U.S. pressure. That defiance throws Ghana's decision into sharper focus. Because if Washington leaned on Nigeria, what are the odds it didn't lean just as heavily on Accra? The U.S. has already slapped Ghana with visa restrictions. It has imposed a 15% tariff on Ghanaian exports. Relations have grown increasingly strained. And yet, Ghana still signed on. The conclusion is hard to ignore. It's highly likely that the same pressure tactics used on other nations were at play here. Ghana's choice may not have been one of free will, but of survival. It's highly likely that Washington sweetened the deal, perhaps the promise of lifting visa restrictions, perhaps reducing tariffs, and in return, Ghana agreed, though on one condition. It would only accept deportees from West Africa. In a way, this makes sense. Ghana shares history, culture, and borders with its neighbors. Accepting fellow West Africans is far different from taking in strangers from across the world. Unlike Rwanda or Eswatini, which have agreed to accept non-African deportees, Ghana drew a line. And there's another hard truth to face. If African countries refuse to take back their own citizens, where else can these deportees go? In that sense, Ghana's decision is not only practical, it may even be the right choice. But on the world stage, the story looks different. Because each time a deal like this is signed, Africa's image takes another hit. Instead of being seen as a partner in global security, the continent risks being branded as something else entirely, a dumping ground for the world's unwanted. And it's important to remember, this story didn't begin with the United States. For years, Australia, the United Kingdom, and the European Union have followed the same playbook. They outsource asylum processing and deportations to African nations. On the surface, it's about controlling migration. In reality, it shifts the burden onto countries with limited resources and weaker protections. The result? Deep ethical and legal questions about how refugees and asylum seekers are treated. And at its core, it reflects a mindset the West has carried for decades, that Africa's interests are secondary to their own. But should we really be surprised? This has been the pattern of history, which is why the solution cannot come from outside. Instead of looking west, Africa must look inward. If the continent builds, develops, and creates opportunities at home, fewer citizens will feel forced to migrate illegally, and Africa will no longer be seen as a dumping ground, but as a partner equal in strength and dignity. So, what do you think? Did Ghana make the right choice, or has it set a dangerous precedent? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget, like this video, share your opinion, and subscribe for more.